Hello, psych students, and welcome to the classical conditioning lecture. I am Professor Zeeb. So we're going to give you a rundown of the model of learning known as classical conditioning. So some really classic stuff in this particular lecture. Classical conditioning is generally credited to this gentleman, Ivan Pavlov, that you can see in the center of the screen. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who, oddly enough, was doing some experiments with dogs, more specifically dog saliva, and in doing so he discovered something great, which we are still talking about today in psychology. Basically what Pavlov noticed is that whenever one of his lab workers would walk in the room, as you can kind of see here, wearing this white lab coat, the dog would immediately start drooling at the sight of the person. So Pavlov thought that was kind of interesting that the dog had to learn basically how to do that. In other words, obviously, the dog is associating food with that person and is anticipating being fed. But for our purposes here, we're going to present it as a model of learning, which of course we're going to apply to humans. So let's kind of discuss how this basically would happen here. So classical conditioning, to give you a formal definition, it's the way in which an organism learns a new association between paired stimuli. In other words, things that occur together in time often become associated in our mind. So Pavlov discovered that if he could pair things like the sound of a bell or even a metronome with food, the dog would eventually learn to respond in a similar way. Okay, so let's walk you through the components. First component is called the unconditioned stimulus, or the UCS. The way I want you to think of unconditioned is unlearned. So an unconditioned stimulus is any stimuli that ordinarily or automatically elicits what we call an unconditioned response. In other words, what we're saying is that this naturally leads to this. The UCS naturally leads to the UCR. So in our example with Pavlov, the UCS would be food, and the UCR would be salivation. In other words, the dog did not have to learn how to salivate to food because they are animals, they're always hungry, it's a natural thing. Our third component is called the neutral stimulus, which is just that, it is neutral. In other words, what we're saying here is the neutral stimulus does not have a response, so there is no response, it is neutral. So going to our Pavlov example, the neutral stimulus would be the lab worker the very first day the dog saw this person and did not know they were associated with food. So in other words, in terms of the response, that person is neutral. Obviously, this stimulus was being paired with the unconditioned stimulus daily, so these two things were occurring together and being paired in time. So eventually, Pavlov discovered that the dog would salivate to the presence of a person. So that neutral stimulus now becomes a learned stimulus, or as Pavlov stated, a conditioned stimulus, which produces a conditioned response. In other words, after learning, the presence of the person, which was originally a neutral stimulus, now becomes the conditioned stimulus and produces salivation, a conditioned response. The dog is now salivating to the sound of the person. So Pavlov noticed that the dog would even do this in hearing their footsteps down the hall or merely seeing the person. In other words, it's just sort of explaining how we learn things and we think it's by association. So let's give you another example here. Excuse me. So we're going to take a look at this diagram here. So if you look up here at the top, number one, before conditioning, Our food is an unconditioned stimulus which produces the response of salivation, as we've already discussed. So the UCS is leading to the UCR. We would then blow a whistle to the dog, a neutral stimulus. And so before conditioning, the dog would not react to that. There would be no response. So this is what we consider to be a neutral stimulus. We would then, if you look at number 3, pair the whistle and the food together in time. In other words, we would blow the whistle and then show the dog food. The neutral stimulus is being paired with the unconditioned stimulus. The dog, of course, salivates because food is in the picture. And then after several pairings, and keep in mind this could happen after one pairing, that whistle now becomes a conditioned stimulus, a learned stimulus, which is producing salivation or a conditioned response. So now that whistle is associated with food in the dog's mind, and it's producing the conditioned response of salivation. So this may explain, for example, when your dog hears the sound of his leash, he may start jumping around, acting crazy, anticipating the walk. So in other words, the sound of the leash, originally a neutral stimulus, becomes a conditioned stimulus, which signifies that the walk is nearing. So that sort of concludes our lecture on classical conditioning. Please go to the next examples.